Here is the paradox no one warns you about. The harder you try to force discipline, the more your mind resists. In ancient Japan, warriors learned something unsettling. Obedience of the self was not achieved through pressure, but through stillness. He sits down to begin, and immediately something pushes back. Not with force, not with threat, with weight. The body feels heavier than it should. Limbs resist movement as if gravity has quietly increased. The breath shortens, the posture collapses inward, the mind looks for exits. Not obvious ones, respectable ones. Thoughts arrive disguised as logic, reasonable measured, convincing. Latter. You've already made progress. Rest first, then act. Each sentence sounds kind. Each one protects comfort. Each one delays commitment just enough to feel harmless. This is not laziness. Laziness does not argue. This is negotiation. He fights himself every day, not in dramatic bursts, in small private skirmishes no one else sees. He wins sometimes, just enough to keep hope alive. But every time he listens to the voice of delay, he loses a little ground. The line shifts, the standard lowers. What once felt unacceptable becomes tolerable. The body remembers. It learns which voice wins. It adjusts its resistance accordingly. Modern culture calls this lack of motivation. As if motivation were a resource to be summoned, as if the problem were absence of desire. Ancient Japan called it something else entirely. A man at war with his own mind, they understood this war well. They knew the enemy did not arrive with banners. It arrived as inner dialogue. The samurai did not trust the mind in moments like this. The mind seeks survival, not honor. It protects energy, not direction. Zen saw the source clearly. The self clings to comfort when it lacks stillness. It fills silence with argument. It avoids emptiness by manufacturing delay. Bushido named the cost. A man who cannot command himself cannot be trusted with anything else. Each time he obeys the voice of postponement, the war tilts against him, not catastrophically. Incrementally, resolve thins, action feels heavier the next time. The gap between intention and execution widens. This is how men lose without noticing, not through collapse. Through erosion, the Ronin knew this moment well. This quiet resistance before action. This internal standoff where nothing external is wrong and yet nothing moves. He did not argue with the voice. Argument feeds it. He acted before the dialogue could finish forming, movement cut through thought, ritual replaced debate, because once the body moves, the mind follows. This is the line most men never cross. They wait to feel ready. They wait for clarity. They wait for motivation to grant permission. And in that waiting, the war is already being lost. The man who decides once does not sit and negotiate daily. He removes the question entirely. Until that happens, every beginning will feel like resistance. Every action will feel heavier than it should. Not because the task is hard, but because two versions of the self are still fighting for control. And as long as that war continues, no amount of advice will save him. Only a decision that leaves nothing left to argue with. The Last Ronin did not conquer resistance by force. Force creates opposition. Opposition creates friction. Friction multiplies what it tries to erase. He dissolved resistance instead. Zen monks sat unmoving for hours, not to punish the body, not to prove endurance. They sat to exhaust the argument, to let every excuse rise, speak, and fall away. To remain until the mind ran out of reasons to move. Stillness was not discipline. It was subtraction. Each passing minute stripped away another layer of noise. Another negotiation, another false emergency. Bushido rituals were repeated with exactness, not for tradition, not for ceremony. For removal, every ritual eliminated choice. Choice invited hesitation. Hesitation invited delay. The same motion, the same order, the same time, day after day. The body learned before the mind could interfere. Movement became inevitable. Debate became irrelevant. This was the Lotus discipline. The Lotus does not fight the mud. It does not curse the weight below it. It does not exhaust itself trying to escape the water. It grows because the mud no longer matters. Zen stillness stripped the mind of noise. When nothing moves, nothing argues. When nothing argues, resistance has no language left. Bushido ritual stripped life of hesitation. When the path is fixed, doubt has nowhere to stand. When action is prescribed, fear arrives too late. Together, they formed a system that did not overpower the self. It outlasted it. They revealed a principle the modern mind resists violently. Because it removes the illusion of heroic struggle. Resistance is not an obstacle. Obstacles oppose you. Resistance is excess motion, unnecessary thought, unnecessary choice, unnecessary self. The man who fights resistance stays locked in motion. The man who dissolves it moves cleanly through. This is why the Ronin appeared calm under weight. Why effort looked quiet in his hands. Why fatigue did not argue with him. He did not push harder. He removed what pushed back. And once excess motion is gone, what remains does not need discipline. It moves because there is nothing left to stop it. Your nervous system will protest this truth. Immediately, instinctively, not because it is wrong, but because it threatens familiarity. The brain evolved to avoid discomfort. Discomfort signaled danger long before it signaled growth. So it tightens, it delays, it searches for safer ground. The ego evolved to protect identity, not truth, not alignment. Identity prefers consistency over accuracy. It defends who you have been, even when who you have been is failing you. Every unfamiliar demand feels like threat, not to survival, to continuity. Zen saw this clearly. Resistance was not hatred of pain, it was attachment to sensation. The mind clings to what it knows. Even suffering, once familiar, feels safer than silence. Noise feels preferable to emptiness. Bushido named the same impulse without mercy fear of loss. Loss of comfort. Loss of self-image. Loss of the story that explains why things are the way they are. To change is to admit something must die. And the ego treats that admission like an execution order. Modern psychology arrives at the same conclusion from another angle. Resistance spikes not during struggle, but during anticipation, the moment before effort. The pause where the mind imagines cost, where it rehearses fatigue, boredom, failure. That is where most men stop. But here is what the Ronin learned. The mind is not a counsel to be consulted. It is a servant to be directed. The mind obeys fastest when it is not asked for permission, when action precedes explanation, when movement interrupts narrative, when ritual replaces choice. The Ronin did not wait for agreement. Agreement is slow. It invites debate. He moved first. The body stepped forward before the mind could object, before the ego could assemble its case. And something shifted. Resistance did not vanish. It arrived late enough to lose authority, late enough to be ignored. This is the unseen turning point, not overpowering the self, outranking it. The man who negotiates with his mind daily will always feel resistance as a wall. The man who acts before asking feels resistance as background noise. And over time, even that fades not, because the nervous system changes overnight, but because it learns who is in command. The internal war does not end when resistance disappears. It ends when resistance no longer gets a vote. The Lotus discipline demands something radical. You do not motivate yourself. Motivation is unstable. It rises and collapses with mood, sleep, and circumstance. You remove the conditions that create resistance. Zen teaches non-interference, not passivity, precision. You observe the urge to avoid, the tightening in the chest, the subtle leaning away from effort, the thought that says later without raising its voice. And you do nothing with it, no suppression, no argument, no attempt to feel different. The urge is allowed to exist, but it is not obeyed. It passes the way weather passes when nothing feeds it attention. Bushido teaches ritualized action. Action stripped of personality, of mood, of preference. You act not because you feel ready, but because the ritual has begun. The body moves because it is time to move. The sequence unfolds because it always unfolds. No permission requested. This is where the modern mind revolts. It wants explanation, a reason it can approve of, a story it can agree with. It wants negotiation, terms, exceptions, emergency exits hidden in language. It wants emotional agreement before effort. It wants the feeling of alignment before it offers compliance. But alignment does not precede action. It follows it. Obedience emerges when action becomes impersonal, when movement is no longer tied to identity, when the task is performed without asking who it proves you to be. You are no longer trying. Trying implies struggle. Struggle implies resistance. You are simply performing the form. Hands move. Breath settles. The sequence completes itself. The self that argues is left behind, standing still, with nothing to interrupt. This is why the Lotus discipline works. It does not crush resistance. It outpaces it. By the time the mind forms an objection, the body is already halfway through the motion. And eventually, the objections arrive later, then weaker, then not at all, not because the mind has been defeated, but because it has been relieved of authority. The man who negotiates daily must convince himself endlessly. The man who performs the form does not need conviction. He needs only to begin. And once beginning becomes automatic, the path stops feeling chosen. It feels inevitable. At point, discipline no longer feels like effort. It feels like gravity acting on something that has finally stopped resisting its own direction. Fire does not resist burning. It consumes because that is its nature. Water does not resist flowing. It yields to gravity without complaint. Steel does not resist the forge. It becomes what heat and pressure demand. Resistance appears only when identity interferes. When the mind inserts commentary, when the ego asks what this effort says about you, when the self demands recognition before obedience. Zen practice removes commentary, it leaves sensation without story breath, without judgment, movement without narration. When nothing is explained, nothing argues back. Bushido practice removes choice. Choice invites hesitation. Hesitation invites negotiation. Negotiation invites decay. Ritual replaces decision. Sequence replaces preference. The body moves. Because the body moves, neuroscience supports what the ancients lived. Repeated, a motionless action quiets the prefrontal cortex. The part of the brain that doubts, that weighs, that delays, the brain shifts from debate to execution, from self-conscious effort to silent compliance. Consistency without drama rewires behavior, not by force, by repetition that leaves no gaps for interpretation. A gap is never empty. It fills instantly with ego. The moment practice breaks, identity returns. It asks how you feel. It asks what you deserve. It asks if today should be different. And the war begins again. But when ritual remains unbroken, resistance starves. There is nothing for it to feed on. No choice to hijack, no story to defend. The man who practices without gaps does not feel disciplined. He feels carried. The man who allows gaps must reassert himself daily. He bleeds energy before the work even begins. This is the quiet truth. Resistance is not conquered by effort. It is erased by continuity. When identity stops interfering, action becomes natural. And when action is natural, discipline is no longer something you summon. It is simply what happens when nothing inside you is allowed to argue anymore. Ancient warriors never asked how they would feel in battle. Feelings were weather. They changed without warning. They decided how they would act. Decision was made while the mind was clear, while the body was rested, while fear had not yet found its voice. Meditation before dawn, not to relax, to empty to strip the mind of commentary before the world could add its own. Movements rehearsed before fear. Again, so that when fear arrived, it found nothing new to disrupt. Only familiar motion, waiting to continue. Armor prepared before doubt. Straps tightened in silence. Edges checked without haste. Doubt thrives on improvisation. Preparation starves it. The Last Ronin carried this inward. He predecided everything that mattered, not as a list. As law when resistance arose, he did not respond. Response implies dialogue. Dialogue implies delay. He let resistance pass like sound through an empty room. When fatigue appeared, he followed form, not intensity, not force form. The body knew the sequence. The sequence carried him when energy would not. When emotion surged, he returned to stillness. Stillness was not avoidance, it was ground. Emotion burned itself out when it could not provoke reaction. Modern application is identical. The battlefield has changed, the principle has not. You decide in advance. Before sleep dulls resolve, before pressure distorts judgment. When you wake, what happens? No negotiation, no scanning for mood. When work begins, what happens? No warming up in doubt. No testing willingness. When discomfort appears, what happens? No pause to ask if this is fair. The answer already exists. No debate, no adjustment. No inner committee assembled to vote. This is not rigidity. Rigidity snaps under pressure. This is freedom from friction, from the endless energy loss of deciding again and again who you are allowed to be today. The man who improvises his response bleeds strength in every moment of hesitation. The man who predecides moves cleanly through resistance without naming it. By the time weakness arrives, the path is already moving beneath his feet. And when action no longer requires permission, life stops feeling heavy, not because it is easy, but because nothing inside you is pulling the other way anymore. One day, the struggle is gone. Not conquered, not suppressed. Simply absent. There is no announcement, no final victory lap, no moment you mark on a calendar. You notice it only because something isn't there. You sit and work begins. Not because you summoned discipline, not because you argued yourself into motion. It begins because that is what happens now. You rise, and the body follows. No delay, no checking for permission, no internal scan for resistance. You move without inner argument, because there is no one left inside you to object. The noise that once filled the space before action has thinned into silence. Not forced silence, earned silence. This is the quiet power of the Lotus discipline. Zen empties the mind not of thought, but of excess, of commentary, of the constant need to explain yourself to yourself. When the mind is empty, nothing pulls against the present moment. Bushido orders the body through ritual, through repetition, through forms that do not ask how you feel today. The body learns first, the mind follows later, or not at all. And in that order, something irreversible happens. The man who once negotiated daily is replaced by the man who acts once and then lives inside that decision. There is no drama in this transformation. Drama belongs to conflict. Conflict belongs to division. Here, there is only alignment. The Last Ronin stands as the image of this state. Not exalted, not heroic, undistracted. A man stripped of excess selves. A man with no energy spent managing hesitation. A man whose days move forward without friction. He does not feel powerful. Power is noisy. He feels inevitable. Because force is no longer required, willpower is no longer summoned. Motivation is no longer consulted. There is nothing left to resist. When resistance disappears, effort becomes clean, endurance becomes quiet. Life becomes direct. And at that point, discipline is no longer something you practice. It is simply the shape your life has taken after everything unnecessary has finally been removed. If this philosophy resonates with you, subscribe for more lessons from the Last Ronin and the Path of Japan, Bushido, and Zen. Discipline is not domination. It is stillness so complete that obedience becomes effortless.